Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Known as the protoevangelium, Genesis 3:15 promises that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. In what sense does this apply to Jesus? We're joined by Mark Heffley to talk about this. Dr. Mark Heffley is Assistant Professor of Theology and Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota. Mark, great to speak with you. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Good. How about you, Marcus?
I'm very, very well, thank you. And thank you for your really good piece in Logos. Let's begin by having you define what the sensus plenior is so that as we engage Genesis 3:15, we can have a full understanding of what Scripture is trying to say.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I should say at the beginning, this was recently published, but I wrote it a couple of years ago. So I had to kind of refresh my memory on what even I wrote. So the sensus plenior, most people are familiar with the literal sense, and then the spiritual senses, like allegorical, moral, and anagogical. The fuller sense, sensus plenior in Latin, the fuller sense is kind of like a bridge between the spiritual senses and the literal sense. So it's a sense of the words, which only comes to full light in light of the mystery of Christ. So the example in Genesis 3, crushing the serpent. Now that Christ has come on the scene, now we can read Genesis 3 as, oh, of course, all along, that's referring to Jesus.
Without getting too much into the weeds of academic Scripture scholarship, I want to ask if you could speak to how this concept of the sensus plenior was a little tainted because of the work of Raymond Brown.
Oh, yeah. I would hesitate to say that it was tainted by Raymond Brown. I think Raymond Brown was one of its great champions. So he wrote his doctoral dissertation on the sensus plenior and really brought it to the forefront of at least Catholic scholarship. And then about 15 years later, he presented a paper at a conference in which he brought up legitimate challenges related to the sensus plenior, and they're hard. I mean, they're real challenges. And he didn't close the door on the sensus plenior. He said, "Hey, I think this is a viable category of meaning, but just don't know how to get around these obstacles." So, in some way he tainted it insofar as he brought up challenges, but I think he was right to put his finger on those challenges. And so in the article, I present Robert Sokolowski as offering a way around those challenges.
And what is that way?
Well, some of the biggest issues with the sensus plenior that Raymond Brown addressed were rooted in a scholastic understanding of how language works and intentionality. So the short and sweet of it, this is oversimplification, but with the scholastic model, like you find with Thomas or others, first you have an idea in your mind, and then you communicate that through the writing. And so the intention of the human author is equated with the idea that was in the human author's mind. All right, and that's also the meaning of the text, so at least on a literal level. So the question, how this became a problem with the sensus plenior, is are we trying to get at the idea that was in the human author's mind or the idea that's in the divine author's mind? And what's the relationship between those two? So the author of Genesis 3, did they have Christ in mind when they talked about a descendant of the woman crushing the head of the serpent? And it seemed like, in order to avoid divorcing the human author from the divine author, you would have to say something like, well, yeah, the human author knew about Jesus, at least on some level. because that's the idea that was in their mind. Sokolowski gets around that problem, I think, by reframing how we think about language. So when we listen to somebody speak, we're not primarily focusing on the idea that's present in that speaker's mind. We're focusing our attention together towards the thing that they're talking about. And so with that in mind, why that resolves the issue is it's no longer a question of how the divine mind and the human mind relate to each other in the context of inspiration of Scripture. It's how is the reality that the text is referring to come to full light with the mystery of Christ.
Now, I know you've already touched on this, but most of our listeners are aware of the typical two senses of the reading of Scripture, and under the spiritual sense, the three categories or the three senses. Could you please walk us through that once again for the sake of our listeners, so that we can then see how this fuller sense applies?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the base sense of Scripture is the literal sense, and there's many different opinions about what the literal sense is. In the modern period, it's been associated or connected with the intention of the human author. So what did the human author mean to say in the text? That would be the literal sense. Classically, it wasn't understood in such a way. So you would find definitions like it's just the meaning of the words. So that's the literal sense. Spiritual sense is kind of the deeper meaning that arises from the text. So the allegorical would be how the text refers to Christ. The moral sense would be how the text refers to the moral life. And then the anagogical is the most confusing one. But it refers to our end. So our death, heaven, ultimately heaven. How does this relate to the goal that we're going towards?
And with that understanding, then, how does this sensus plenior, this fuller sense, apply to those classical readings of Scripture?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some ways, it's. I mean, we don't want to drive a hard wedge between the literal sense and the sensus plenior, and the spiritual senses and the sensus plenior. So in some ways, it's going to blur the lines. But the basic distinction between the literal sense and the spiritual senses is does the meaning come from the text itself and the words, or does the meaning come from a relation between things? So let me give you an example. A spiritual sense relates things to each other. So we read in Old Testament passages about David, King David, and we recognize, hey, there's similarities between David, the person, and Jesus. And so we can then read passages about David and relate them to Jesus. But notice that the key move that we're making is we're thinking about David, the person, and relating the person to Jesus. The literal sense is different from that because it's a meaning contained in the words themselves. So some words and some passages in Scripture do not speak about David, would not speak directly to Jesus, even though it's legitimate to relate David to Jesus. Some words or some passages don't relate directly. The sensus plenior would be like the literal sense, meaning it's a meaning contained in the passage. We're not relating things to other things. We're looking at the meaning of the words themselves. But like the spiritual sense, it only comes to the forefront because of Christ.
My guest is Dr. Mark Heffley. He is Assistant Professor of Theology and Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota. And we are talking about Genesis 3:15, really, and applying this concept of the fuller sense of Scripture to reading Genesis 3:15, which we will continue on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Dr. Mark Heffley, Assistant Professor of Theology and Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota. Mark, to continue the application of this fuller sense and talking about Genesis 3:15, introduce our listeners now to this concept of what Genesis 3:15 is as the protoevangelium.
Yeah. Protoevangelium, it's like the first announcement of the gospel. So Genesis 3, we hear about the fall of humanity, and then Genesis through chapter 11 is kind of spiraling out of control. But God announces at the beginning that he's going to fix things. But he announces it in a cryptic way through his curse on the serpent, saying, the descendant of the woman is going to crush your head. And so we refer to that in the Christian tradition, the protoevangelium, because it's like, oh, of course, I was talking about Jesus. He's the seed of the woman who crushes the serpent on the cross. So that's the first announcement of the gospel.
Now, break down for us this exactly what's happening in the protoevangelium in this concept of the fullest sense. What are the images? What are some of the messages that are coming out in Scripture?
Yeah. That's a tough one.
And we'll be here for the next hour.
Yeah. I'll probably think of a lot of things that I should have said after we're done. In the protoevangelium, we hear God address the serpent. And the serpent, oh man, what is the serpent? Well, in the Jewish imagination, the image of a serpent was part of like a storehouse of images to denote forces of chaos, death, and destruction. So Pharaoh of Egypt will be described as a dragon. So any time, even Goliath is kind of depicted as a dragon, although less explicitly. But anyway, any force opposed to God and his people would be an agent of chaos and death and destruction. So the serpent to the Jewish mind, or maybe to the original Israelite mind, would be representing in some fashion the forces opposed to God and his people. Who is the seed and who is the woman? Well, there have been many interpretations throughout history. Is this referring to a specific individual? Is it referring to the nation of Israel? And I don't think we have to close the door on any of those. I think it's one of those passages that could have multiple partial fulfillments. But ultimately, who's the descendant of the woman who defeats the forces of death and destruction opposed to God and his people? Well, it's Jesus. And which individual most fits the bill for being an agent of chaos and death and destruction? Well, Satan. So in the that in the Christian tradition, where it's very commonplace to see the serpent identified with Satan and the seed identified with Jesus.
Considering all that, then, in that common interpretation, what we're seeing is that Genesis 3:15 is an early proclamation of God's plan of salvation. Now, how does that apply to what we've been talking about, this concept of the fullest sense of reading Scripture?
It applies because it's a question of, did the original author have in mind Jesus and Satan? Some people can make the argument, obviously nothing is outside of God's control, and he gives prophetic knowledge to people. So I don't think we have to close the door on that possibility. Mm-hmm. But I also don't think we have to affirm that the historical author of Genesis did know about Jesus when they wrote it. Maybe not. Maybe they had in mind a more immediate application in the nation of Israel or some other figure. But to say that doesn't close the door either on a Christological interpretation. So we can say, let's just imagine the human author had in mind the nation of Israel. And maybe I read somebody arguing that the serpent is representative of Pharaoh. So it's speaking to the immediate context or the historical context of God delivering Israel from Egypt. All right, so let's just assume that's the case for now, although I'm not convinced that's the case. But if that is the case, that doesn't close the door on a Christological interpretation, because the reality that we're directed to think about, God delivering his people in creation from the forces of chaos and death and destruction, that's most perfectly fulfilled in Jesus. So it might not be the literal sense of Scripture or what the human author was intending to convey, but it's a legitimate sense of Scripture, because it's kind of like the fullest illumination of the reality that God is speaking to.
Well, Mark, I want to say thank you very much for making the time to speak with us about this concept of reading Scripture in the fullest sense and understanding the intent of the human author and contrapose it with the intent of God as the divine author. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
My guest has been Dr. Mark Heffley, Assistant Professor of Theology and Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota. We've been talking about Genesis 3:15, and I wanted to end this segment by unpacking Genesis 3:14 to 19 at least for you. Genesis 3 speaks about the fall of man, and this is specifically the point where God confronts Adam, Eve, and the serpent. Genesis 3:14, Yahweh says to the snake, "Because you have done this, accursed be you of all animals wild and tame. On your belly you will go, and on dust you will feed as long as you shall live. I shall put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. It will bruise your head, and you will strike its heel, or he shall bruise your head, and you will strike his heel. To the woman he said, I shall give you intense pain in childbearing. You will give birth to your children in pain. Your yearning will be for your husband, he will dominate you." And it goes on from there. But really, I want to focus on 3:15, which is that prophecy of the seed of the woman that will crush the head of the serpent. This judgment between the seed of the woman and seed of the serpent, there's a lot to unpack here. But one of the key concepts that we need to pay attention to is this is the only place in all of Scripture that speaks to the seed of the woman. In the rest of Scripture, as is typically the case of the rest of Near Eastern texts, it's always the seed of the man. So the seed of the woman has a very particular appeal then to a child to be born that has a direct affiliation to a woman, but for some reason, no direct affiliation to a man. It's not too much of a leap from there to then say that the seed of the woman is born entirely of the woman, and therefore the woman has not known a man, and so to jump ahead to Jesus. Now, one of the arguments that Mark was making earlier is that some interpreters would say that's not the intention of the human authors, they would not have known. And you might make that argument, but God knows. And that's the beautiful wonder of the mystery of dual authorship, that even when the human authors did not have the most perfect interpretation, understanding, or foresight, God knew the full picture. And that is the unifying principle of all of Scripture. That now when we go back to this verse, we see there's going to be constant warfare between the seed of the serpent, all of those who have aligned themselves to Satan and his evil, and the seed of the woman, Christ, and by virtue of that, secondarily, all of us who get to call the woman, the Ha'isha, the woman, mother. And this comes to real fulfillment in the person of Mary. I want to make this very clear. But to unpack this even further, just to really dive into the text, I shall put enmity between you and the woman. That word for enmity in the Hebrew is very specifically to do with the kind of feud that ends in death. And to put this very plainly, to take this even deeper, between your seed and her seed, he will bruise your head and you will strike his heel. This was written at a time when most of Israel and most of the Near East were an agrarian culture. And therefore, to destroy a serpent, you didn't want to cut off its head, because if you cut off the head immediately, its death throes can still cause quite a bit of damage, including biting, including injecting venom. So it was common practice in the Near East, in the Middle East, in fact, I dare say as far as the Far East, and even here in the West, that in order to properly destroy a venomous serpent, the head had to be completely crushed. So to say he will crush your head is to say he will do away with you once and for all. But in the process of him crushing your head, you will strike his heel. Logic would tell you that if you speak about the striking of a heel by a venomous serpent, in an age and an era where anti-venom didn't exist, and emergency rooms did not exist, what God was saying to the serpent as a direct prophecy is, at some point in this entire work that God was enacting from this point on, protoevangelium, the first gospel, from this point on in Genesis 3:15, all the way till Jesus' finished work on the cross, God was going to begin and enact a work of salvation that would result in the destruction of Satan and all evil, once and for all, but the agent of that redemption and salvation would himself be struck by evil and die. You will strike his heel. It is no coincidence, then, that history tells us that the crucifixion records show the nail that went through Jesus' feet didn't go through the top of his feet. It went through where the heel bones would intersect, so that the nail, long and hard as it was, would be able to support the entirety of the weight of the human person as they hung upon the cross. So there's a lot of correlation here to the fact that this points to Jesus' crucifixion being the moment of the destruction of Satan's work. And this points to the work of God in bringing about the reversal of what Adam and Eve had done, but also what Satan had done in tempting Adam and Eve. And if you know the full account of the fall, you see that Adam does not take responsibility for his fall. Eve does not take responsibility for her fall. Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent. In the new covenant redemption and reversal, at the new tree of life, which is the cross, in the new Garden of Eden, which is Calvary, Christ, the new Adam, takes the full fall. Mary, the new Eve, stands beneath that full fall. And Christ's finished work wins for us so great a salvation and destruction of evil. Stay tuned for the next hour. I'm Marcus Peter.